This video is a brief introduction into how to set up your column for chromatography in the organic chemistry lab. So we're starting here with our column clamped and making sure that we have enough space to get an Erlenmeyer flask underneath it. And we're going to build the column using silica gel. So we're going to take about 20 milliliters of that, and you can just measure this out in a 150 milliliter beaker. Just fill it up to right about the 20 milliliter line with the dry silica gel. Keep in mind that silica gel is an inhalation hazard, so make sure you keep it in the fume hood and are careful in the way that you pour it and dispense it. Okay, so you can see we've got about 20 milliliters there in our beaker, maybe a little bit over that is okay. And we're now going to start to make the slurry. First thing I'm going to do is add some solvent to my Erlenmeyer flask, which will be the vessel that I use continuously here to add solvent to my column, to catch some solvent early on in the column before I start taking fractions. About 50 milliliters of solvent is right. So if you fill that Erlenmeyer up to about the 50 milliliter mark, you're in the right ballpark. We'll add a little bit of that to the silica gel, and then we're going to mix it really well. In this case I'm using a wooden splint to stir, but you can use the glass stirring rod that's available in your fume hood. So that's not quite enough solvent that's in there now. You can see it was pretty thick there. I'm going to add some more solvent and make sure that I have a good slurry so that all the silica is wet, but not so much solvent that I have lots of liquid that I'm going to have to wait to drain out of my column. So you're kind of looking for a melted milkshake consistency for your slurry. Make sure everything's really well mixed, and then we'll go ahead and pour that into the column. Notice I'm putting my Erlenmeyer flask underneath it so that I can catch any of that solvent that drains out. I can reuse that. And then give it a quick stir and pour quickly the slurry into the column. In this case, you're going to want to fill up the column so that you have a silica gel column that's about at the 15 milliliter mark. You'll see that there are markings on the column for volume. So try and get at least 15 milliliters in there of the solid silica once it settles down and packs into the column. Now I'm going to wash down the sides. Notice the washing motion here. You're going to use that pipette to swirl around the top of the column down the sides, and also tapping the column there to get the silica gel to settle without air bubbles. You can see when you do that, the silica gel, I know it's hard to see in this video, it's a little blurry, but the silica gel does start to settle. You can see there's an actual column forming down lower in my column, and I still have a layer of solvent above it, so I need to let that solvent drain out, but I'm not quite at the 15 milliliter mark, so I need to get some more silica in there as well. So I just add a little bit more solvent to what's left in my beaker, make that slurry again, and pour it quickly. And you can repeat that process as many times as you need to get the column as tall as you need. Notice again the swirling motion. You touch the sides of the column there and swirl that pipette to wash down the walls gently, and tapping again to help the column settle, hopefully without any air bubbles. Then we need to just let that solvent drain so that the solids will pack down. And if you take a close look here, you can see I've got a little solvent above my column there, but you can see how it packs down. And I want it again somewhere between the 15 and 17 milliliter mark on the column there. So once my column is packed and the solvent has drained into the top of it, I'm going to add a little bit of sand to the top. Just sprinkle about a centimeter or so right on top of that column, and that'll protect the surface so that it stays nice and even. And once I get that layer of sand on top, I'm going to need to add a little bit more solvent to make sure the sand is wet, and also I wash down the walls of that column. So you can see here a little bit of that sand layer on top of my column. Now again with my pipette, using that swirling motion, just washing down any sand clinging to the walls of the column. And we'll let that solvent that we added drain into the sand, right into the top of the column, and then we'll be ready to add our sample. Alright, remember that you want to add your sample in one shot. So the right way to use a Pasteur pipette is to grasp it in your fingers as shown here, and close your fingers around it and use your thumb to depress the bulb. Squeeze all the air out of it, and then you have complete control of how much you're pulling into the pipette with one hand. With that action, you can pull all of the liquid here into your pipette using just one hand, and then it's easy to transfer your pipette to the top of the column, and again using that swirling motion, adding your sample right to the top. And you just want to do it in one shot, so slowly squeeze the bulb of that pipette and make your layer of sample right on top of the column, and don't add anything else. Let that sample drain into the column until you see that liquid get to the top of the sand layer. Don't add anything. And once that happens, you can go ahead and add a little bit of solvent. Start with just a tiny bit, just a little bit to wash down the walls on the column. Let that drain in. You're trying to get any residual sample into that column with a minimum amount of solvent. Remember, you're trying to add your sample in a very tight band right there at the top. And then once that drains in, now you can start to add solvent to the top of the column. And again, start with that gentle motion, just a little bit at a time, and build up a layer of solvent on top of the column. Once you've got a good layer and you don't think you'll disturb the top of the column by pouring the solvent or adding more, then you can add more quickly. But in the beginning, add a little bit, let it drain into the column once or twice after you've added your sample, and then go ahead and using that gentle swirling motion, build up a layer of solvent on top. So there's my liquid has just now drained into the sand. That was my wash liquid, or my second wash, I believe, of my sample into the column. So now I'm ready to go ahead and build up my layer of solvent. Again, putting a whole pipette full in there, using that swirling motion. And I continue to do that. You want to do it at least until you get up to the wider part of the column. Then at that point, you'd probably be safe to gently pour in the solvent, but I'm just gonna, because I'm on a roll, go ahead and keep adding it by pipette here. I don't have too much to add. But notice I don't swirl anymore. I just go ahead and squeeze that liquid right into the reservoir at the top of the column. Alright, I've got a reservoir of solvent on top of my column. My column is draining. If you look down there at the bottom, it's dripping slowly. I'm not going to start collecting fractions immediately because I know I have to get some of that solvent to pass through before the sample will come out. So you can let it drain for just a couple of minutes without collecting fractions, but then you're going to want to go ahead and start collecting in individual test tubes. And we're using the small test tubes to collect the fractions as they exit from the column. And we'll test the contents of those test tubes using TLC. So you see I've got a TLC set up here, ready to go. So after a couple of minutes, I'm going to replace my Erlenmeyer flask with my first test tube. And we'll just hold it under the column. And I'm going to crank the jack up a little bit so that it'll hold my test tube in place. And I'll just let the fraction slowly collect into that test tube. And once the test tube is full, I'll just swap it out for a fresh one. And we keep doing that until we've collected all the sample that we need. And remember that you don't want to test each fraction individually on a separate TLC plate. You can spot about 6 of them on the same plate.